All right, now we're gonna be putting the cams back on and bolting down the covers that go on top of it. And again, just keep in mind that everything gets put back in the same order it came off. All right, and I'm gonna start off by putting on the exhaust cam first. And remember, we're gonna be lining up our yellow mark that's on the chain to the mark here on the exhaust cam. You can see the yellow mark here on the bottom. I'm gonna slide in my cam first into the chain, then simply rotate the cam until the marks meet. Like so. Now once the chain is sitting on the cam itself, the best thing I like to do is use a zip tie through the gear to hold down the chain onto the gear. Therefore, while you're moving things around, the markings will always stay where they're at. And just give you a closer view that the markings are meeting together, letting us know that the exhaust side is on the right spot. All right, now moving on to the intake side, we're gonna do the exact same thing. We're gonna pull the chain and get our cam in there. You can see the markings there already. Of course, they're not lined up yet. And as you can see, the yellow mark is meeting with the white mark. And I'm gonna be doing the same thing using a zip tie. Therefore, we no longer have to worry about the chain moving on us. All right, now we got that secured. All right, now I'm gonna be putting all the covers back on. Now all these covers do have an arrow, and all those arrows should be facing the front of the cams. And I'm just gonna tighten all these just enough to where they're barely grabbing for now. And it's better to start on this one here, because once you tighten this one a little bit down, it'll make it a lot easier to tighten this one in the back. All right, some of the bolts are snug for now, so I know for sure the cam's not gonna move on me. I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing on the intake side. And again, don't forget, the arrow goes towards the front of the cam where the gears are at. All right, now I'm gonna snug all the bolts down in a crisscross pattern. I'm gonna snug down the center ones first, then snug the ones in the back, and then finally do the ones in the front. And again, I'm just snugging all these down because I will be torquing all of these down to specs. All right, so I got my torque wrench here, and I just got to set it up to 7.5 foot-pounds, which as you can see, I have ready here. So I'm gonna be using this to make sure that all the bolts are tightened to their correct torque specs. All right, so I'm gonna start off on the exhaust side, tightening the center one first in crisscross pattern. Once I've done this one, I'm gonna do the same for the one in the front, and then move on to the one in the back. All right, now that the center one is done, now I'm gonna move on to the front one. And now finally moving on to the back. All right, now this next part you don't have to do, but I like double checking all my bolts just in case. So in order from back to the front, I'm gonna be rechecking all the bolts. All right, now moving on to the intake side, starting off with the center one first and doing the exact same procedure like we did on the exhaust side. Remember, we're gonna do crisscross pattern. And then moving on to the one in the back. All right, and now I'm just gonna double check all my bolts from the back to the front once again. All right guys, and now it's time to get the tensioner ready to be put back onto the engine. Now you can see this little clip here. It has a little bit of an X shape. What we need to do is squeeze that while we're pushing this piece all the way down. And before you do, you gotta make sure that this pin here that sticks out from the top, as you can see, faces this clip here, because that's what's gonna hold this down to put this back on the engine. So I'm gonna go ahead and rotate this towards that clip there. And I'm gonna be squeezing this with a set of pliers, just enough pressure to be able to push this all the way down. And once this piece is pretty close to this clip, you're just gonna move this clip over this pin here and it should hold it down. So I'm gonna go ahead and squeeze this clip here. And then now I'm just squeezing all the way down. I gotta go a little bit further. And once I'm close enough, I can flip this piece here to hold down that pin on top. And now at this point, the tensioner is ready to be put back onto the engine. All right, now when putting the tensioner back onto the engine, this clip piece here, the part that's holding down the tensioner, should be facing down towards the bottom of the engine. And it also has an arrow on the back of it. Just make sure that it's facing the upward position. And that arrow is not gonna be directly up. It's gonna be more towards the side, but again, as long as it's facing upward. So this tensioner with the pin facing down is gonna go just like this, back into the engine. And also just double check your gasket that it's on correctly. All right, now once you have it pretty much in, go ahead and put back both bolts. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten these all the way. Okay, as you can see, we still have slack here, and that's because the tensioner hasn't been activated yet. So in order to do that, just have to turn the bottom timing gear backwards about half a quarter. And now I know I said you're not supposed to be turning this sprocket backwards, but this is the only time you're gonna have to do that, just to activate that tensioner. And about right there should be good enough to activate the tensioner. Once we've done that, we're gonna go ahead and move this mark back to where it was here. And now you're gonna see that the tensioner was activated because now checking on top is no longer loose. So at this point, we can go ahead and cut our zip ties off on both intake and the exhaust. And as you can see, the intake side is perfectly aligned with both marks meeting together. And so is the exhaust side. So I know for sure that the timing on the engine is correct. All right, I do want to say before checking all the clearance on all the valves again, now turning this 360 degrees twice is one whole resolution. You want to make sure that you rotate the engine at least 4 to 5 complete resolutions, just to make sure that the shims settle in place, and then you can check the clearance on all the valves again. So at this point, I have to check all the valves once again to see if we're within specs, just like we did earlier on the video, starting off with piston 1, then rotating the gear in the bottom 180 degrees, moving on to piston 2, then rotating it again to move on to piston 4, and then one more time to finally check piston 3. Now I'm gonna go ahead and do the whole process again off camera, but I'm gonna show you the numbers I ended up with to see if I have to remove any of the shims again. So just redo all the steps I showed you earlier on the video. All right, so I ended up having to remove the cam again because of course that one was out of specs. Now I didn't want to tell you this before because I wanted to show you how to remove both cams, but if one of the sides are all in specs, there's no need to remove that side cam. As you can see, the intake cam is still in place and I haven't loosened any of those bolts. I only had to remove all 3 of the exhaust caps because again, I only have to work on the exhaust side, so there's no need for extra work. So I'm pretty sure I only got to do this one more time and I'll show you the new adjustments once I'm done. All right, so at this point, we got all the valves within specs. So now we can start the process on putting everything back together. Now I'm not gonna be showing you how to put everything back because this is gonna make the video way too long. So I'm just gonna be showing you putting back the valve cover, casing on the side, and the throttle bodies, because the throttle bodies can be a little hard putting back on, but there is some small tricks you can do to make it easier. All right, before putting the valve cover back on, just inspect the entire gasket to make sure it's clean and then there's no cracks or rips anywhere on it. Now, if you're having kind of the same issue where the gasket doesn't stay in place on certain areas, as you can see on my left side, my right side, we could use some gasket maker in between the gasket and the valve cover itself to hold it in place. I'm just gonna be putting a little bit on the edges, not too much. And obviously you wanna make sure that there's no oil in between, otherwise the gasket maker is not gonna stick on very well. Also gonna be putting some on the right side. Again, it doesn't have to be too much, just enough to hold it in place. All right, at this point, I'm just gonna let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'm gonna be putting some more gasket maker in these areas here, as well as the other side, just to assure that no oil comes out from those areas. All right, now that I let that dry up a little bit, I'm gonna go ahead and put some more gasket maker on those corners, like I said. And we don't need to put too much, just enough to fill up that area a little bit. And same thing on the other side. So now we can go ahead and put the valve cover back on the engine. All right, so I find the easiest way to put this valve cover back on is if we actually go backwards first, like so, and then turning up the bottom end carefully without moving that gasket so much. And then we could slide it in from the right side first, little by little. And then just slide it all the way to the back. Like so. You might make a little bit of mess with the gasket maker, but that's okay. As long as the gasket is where it needs to be and there's still some gasket maker on those corners. And just check the gasket all the way around, and if everything looks good, we can go ahead and put our 6 bolts that bolt down the valve cover to the head. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start putting on the 6 bolts that hold down the valve cover. I'm just gonna be snugging these down for now, by hand first. All right, now that they're all snug, I'm gonna start off by tightening the center ones first, then crisscross my way out to evenly tighten down the valve cover. Now you don't need to tighten these extremely hard because you will strip them out. Just make sure that they're tight and not over tighten. So as you can see, that's as tight as I can go softly with the ratchet. And then I'm just gonna go a little more. And that should be it. Now that I've done the center ones, I'm gonna go ahead and start crisscrossing. All right, now moving on to putting this gasket back on. You definitely want to start making sure that the air is all clean with no oil on it or any of the old gaskets still on there. You can go ahead and put this back in place. And I was able to salvage the old gasket, so I'm going to be reusing it. But also I like to put a thin layer of gasket maker all around the casing just to play it safe. And I usually put a little bit more gasket maker in this area to make sure it stays sealed correctly. All right, now I'm just going to put a little bit more in this area. Like so, and I'm gonna be doing the same for this side as well. Again, I'm just putting a thin layer, just enough to cover all the silver, and I should be good. All right, just like that, and I'm gonna be placing the gasket on this side. Therefore, once it's all together, I can just simply put the cover back in its place. And just make sure that these 2 pins are pushed all the way in, therefore they don't give you any issues. All right, got my gasket in place. Now I'm simply just gonna put this piece back on the engine. And don't worry if you put gasket maker on the cover, because you could always take it off later. And now we can go ahead and put all our bolts back onto this casing. And by the way, ignore this bolt, guys, because that's not the bolt that belongs there. It's just there temporarily. Remember when putting these 2 bolts back on, that the bracket for the clutch cable goes on first, and then the bolts. All right, now I'm gonna snug all these bolts first and crisscross pattern as much as possible. Once they're evenly tightened all the way around, just gonna tighten them one by one. Once again, once that I feel that it's snug, with just turning it with the ratchet, I'm just gonna go a little bit more, and that's it. And this part is good to go. All right, now it's time to put the throttle bodies back in place. We're gonna go ahead and remove these paper towels that were covering these hoses to make sure we don't drop anything in there. Now, if yours still has this cover on, go ahead and place it back on. All right, now the biggest trick that I have to make this job a lot easier to put throttle bodies back in their spot is just to put a little layer of grease inside these rubber pieces here on all 4 of them. And sometimes you can get lucky and not have to use any of the grease, but at this point I always use grease just to make the job easier the first time. Now, if for some reason the grease trick does not work, you could always use a heat gun, heating up all 4 of these rubbers to expand them a little bit, and then you can put the throttle bodies and snap them in. All right, putting grease on the first one. And again, it doesn't have to be a lot, just enough to make it slippery. Moving on to the third one. And now the last one. All right, now before putting your throttle body completely back on, you want to make sure that you connect everything that's electrical first to make this a lot easier. And also be sure that you go ahead and put the connections for the coils back to the front before putting on your throttle body. Otherwise, you're gonna have to remove the throttle body again just to put these in the front. All right, here's my first connection here. I'm gonna have to put the throttle bodies a little forward to put the other 2. Don't forget to reconnect the sensor here in the corner. And then lastly, don't forget to do the sensor in the center. All right, now we can put our throttle bodies in place. Just make sure they align with all 4 of the tubes before you push down. Then you're gonna be pushing down firmly on the top of the throttle bodies with both hands, with one hand on each side, until you feel the throttle bodies snap in place. All right, guys, so at this point, all you're gonna have to do is reverse the steps that were in the beginning of the video, because I don't want to make this video too long than what it already is. So I'm going to be putting this bike back together and then see how she runs. All right, and one of the things I do want to say before putting the side fairings back on the bike is definitely make sure that the bike is running at that point, because just in case you have an oil leak or something loose, you're not going to waste more time retaking all the fairings off to see what the problem is. So I definitely recommend you checking that it's running before you put everything back on. Before you start up the bike, make sure that the bike primes a couple of times, because again, we did take the fuel tank off and it's going to take a little bit of time for the fuel to hit those injectors. Once you've done that, then you can get the bike started. And another thing I do want to mention is when the bike is running, you might see a little bit of smoke coming from the exhaust area, because more than likely when you took the valve cover off, it's normal for some of the oil to drop on the exhaust. So just keep that in mind. Don't be too alarmed if you see a little bit of smoke. All right, now it's time to see how she sounds. And by the way, guys, ignore those engine codes, because those codes were already on the bike. All right, guys, and that's gonna put an end to this video here. Hoping this helps a lot of people out there like always. And if you've done this before and you have some tips, feel free to drop them in the comments to help myself and others out there. And like always, if you like what you see, hit that like button for me. And if you haven't subscribed and like to see more videos like these, please hit that subscribe button to help grow this channel. And I appreciate the support. But like always, guys, don't forget, God loves every single one of you guys. God bless you guys, and we'll see you on the next video.